Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at, well, arguably one of the most critical pivot points in modern history, the French Revolution. It all kicks off, of course, in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille, and the whole idea was to demolish absolute monarchy, to get rid of this centuries-old system of privilege. The goal was an era of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty. And yet, less than 15 years later, the whole thing is formalized under a military strongman who crowns himself emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte.
And that really is the central paradox, isn't it? It's the question that historians still wrestle with. Was Napoleon's rise to empire in 1804 the logical conclusion, a necessary stabilization that locked in the modernizing aims of 1789? Or did his dictatorship represent a complete, fundamental repudiation, a fatal termination of the revolution's core values?
Exactly. And I'm going to argue that the revolutionary project, when it was left to its own devices, was frankly spiraling into civil war and financial ruin. Napoleon didn't step in as a counter-revolutionary. He was the essential, stabilizing force who cemented the practical, institutional reforms, the economic and social changes that the revolution promised but could never quite deliver on its own.
See, I come at it from a completely different angle. While Napoleon might have preserved some of the administrative gains, his empire was a definitive reversal of the philosophical soul of the revolution. It traded that ideal of self-determination for a very efficient, centralized tyranny, betraying the principles of popular sovereignty that started the whole thing. I mean, if the revolution aimed to end absolute rule, crowning a new emperor isn't consolidation, it's cancellation.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. These abstract ideals of the revolution, they needed a strong hand to translate them into lasting, functional institutions. And that's what Napoleon provided. I mean, just think about the sheer political mess he inherited. The phase right before him, the Directory, from 1795 to 1799, was this system of weak, rotating executives that just catastrophically failed to command any authority. It was corrupt, it was unstable, and it was putting every single economic and social gain since 1789 in jeopardy. Napoleon restored order, yes, but he also enacted concrete, modernizing policies that were themselves revolutionary in their effect.
But order purchased at the expense of political liberty is not a revolutionary success. It's a historical tragedy. The whole essence of the revolution wasn't just getting rid of a king. It was abolishing privilege by birth and establishing the principle that the nation and the nation alone is sovereign. You can't argue Napoleon upheld that when he literally put a crown on his own head in 1804. He turned the republic into a monarchy, non-hereditary at first, sure, and then he starts installing his brothers and sisters on thrones across Europe. He was just replicating the very dynastic system the revolutionaries fought and died to destroy.
But just consider the actual lasting domestic changes, the things that really restructured French society and, crucially, survived his fall in 1815. Napoleon introduced modernizing laws that appealed directly to the social class that drove the revolution, the bourgeoisie. He codified the protection of private property, which was huge. It stabilized the new landowning class, including peasants who had bought up confiscated church lands. And he established the decimal system, a uniform system of weights and measures.
And why is that standardization so revolutionary?
Well, because before the revolution, every region, sometimes every city, had its own measures. It was chaos, and it favored local feudal interests. This new standardized system, codified by Napoleon, allowed for predictable, large-scale national commerce for the first time. He basically codified the economic liberation that this powerful, driving force of the revolution had been seeking.
Okay, that's a compelling argument on commerce and standardization, I'll grant you that. But have you considered the foundational principle that was just shattered? The Declaration of the Rights of Man said unequivocally that the source of all sovereignty resides in the nation. Napoleon explicitly reversed that. But his betrayal wasn't just political, it was profoundly moral. His decision to reintroduce colonial slavery in 1802, just 10 years after the National Convention had freed all slaves, that demonstrates a profound betrayal of natural and inalienable rights. His modernization was selective, it was pragmatic, and it was fundamentally anti-ideological.
And that brings us right to the core of it, doesn't it? This inevitable trade-off between stability and abstract liberty in a time of absolute upheaval. We have to compare Napoleon's autocracy to what came before him. The preceding periods were unstable, destructive, and bloody. We talk about the Terror, which used severe control and punishment to guillotine tens of thousands of people, often just on suspicion.
I agree, the Terror was destructive, but even Robespierre framed it as a necessary defense, a war of liberty against tyranny. However, tragically misguided his methods were. The Terror, in its own horrific way, was at least rhetorically committed to the ideals of the Republic. Napoleon, by contrast, he just replaced the aspirations of the Republic with a straightforward, centralized dictatorship. He basically confirmed Jean-Paul Marat's citable view that the rich would just replace the aristocrats as the new owners of wealth.
But it wasn't just political terror. It was economic terror. The middle classes, the average Parisians, they suffered terribly from subsistence crises and these wild fluctuations in bread prices all through the 1790s. For them, Napoleon's centralized system meant a predictable food supply. It meant an end to the political feuding that threatened their survival and their new property. That strong hand allowed the most crucial social reform, the abolition of feudalism, to not only survive, but to spread across Europe with his armies. His efficiency secured the gains the Directory could only talk about.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the cost was worth the gain. We're talking about taking 3 separate branches of government, legislative, executive, and judiciary, as drafted in the 1791 Constitution, and consolidating them entirely into one man. The revolution aimed to dismantle monarchy. Instead, it created a far more efficient tyranny. The goal wasn't just to stop the bleeding, the goal was to guarantee political participation. When Napoleon silenced the press, limited debate, and ended meaningful elections, he killed the very concept of national sovereignty.
It's true, he did severely limit political participation. But let's step back and look at the nature of his modernization, specifically the Civil Code of 1804.
The Napoleonic Code. The very thing you argue is his greatest achievement is the perfect example of this selective modernization that prioritized property over people. The code secured the rights of the wealthy merchant and the landowner, sure, but it simultaneously cemented the subjugation of half the population. It explicitly confirmed the legal inferiority of women, placing them under the complete authority of their husband or father. It reversed the limited gains they'd made during the earlier, more radical phase of the revolution.
I absolutely acknowledge the grave limitations regarding women's rights, and, of course, the terrible reality of Olympe de Gouges' execution for demanding inclusion.
And it was an oversight Napoleon codified into law. The Declaration of Rights excluded women, and Napoleon cemented that selective application of rights.
Yes, but this brings us back to that difficult, pragmatic choice. Do you secure the institutional foundations for the future, or do you insist on immediate, universal application of abstract rights in a time of chaos? And this is where I have to address your powerful point about slavery. It was a profound betrayal of the ideal of liberty. There's just no denying that. But we also have to understand the situation he inherited. The revolution was bankrupt, and stabilizing the finances, well, it required reopening the colonial economic engine, particularly the profitable sugar colonies, even if it meant a temporary, morally reprehensible trade-off.
I would frame it very differently. The slavery decision wasn't a difficult trade-off. It was a cynical prioritization of profits over the foundational principles of the revolution. It proves his vision was purely pragmatic. It was designed to maximize French power and elite wealth, not any ideological commitment to equality for all citizens. You just cannot claim to be the heir of the revolution when you fundamentally betray the inalienable rights clause of its defining document.
But the legal structure he created, flawed as it was essential for the long-term survival of meritocracy and the end of hereditary privilege. Even if his application was selective, his code was instrumental in abolishing feudal systems across the vast territories he conquered. He implemented a professional bureaucracy based on merit, not birth. That fundamentally changed governance in France and beyond, and that reform proved lasting, long after his empire fell. That institutional inertia, that is the revolution's true victory.
But that meritocracy was achieved by sacrificing the national sovereignty of others. And that leads us to the final contradiction. His perception as a liberator just completely dissolved into that of an invader.
Initially, though, there is no doubt that many Europeans saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. His measures did carry revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe. You just have to look at the unification movements in Germany and Italy later in the century. Their administrative roots trace directly back to Napoleon dissolving all those small, feudal states. The diffusion of that revolutionary energy shows his regime acted as an engine of the revolution's global legacy, however imperfect.
I acknowledge the initial, maybe naive reception, but history shows the reality. His armies soon came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. His empire was built on conquering neighboring countries and deposing their rulers to install his own family. That is an explicit violation of the revolutionary ideal of self-determination. The message was clear. France's liberty was to be achieved at the expense of everyone else's.
But those feudal regimes he replaced were not democracies. They were rigid, antiquated systems. Napoleon brought administrative clarity, secular education, and legal equality to millions of peasants and middle-class professionals across Europe who had been shackled by the old regime. His conquest might have been imperial, but its impact was undeniably transformative and revolutionary. He exported the core social and economic gains of 1789.
Exporting liberation at the point of a bayonet is still fundamentally contradictory to the idea that sovereignty resides in the nation. You cannot champion self-determination and simultaneously force foreign administration on people. And the ultimate response to his imperial project, culminating in his defeat at Waterloo in 1815, proves that trajectory was unsustainable and fundamentally counter-revolutionary. He just sought to replace one form of Bourbon hegemony with a Bonapartist one.
I think, regardless of Waterloo, Napoleon's lasting legacy, the codified law, the meritocratic administration, it demonstrates that he was the essential agent who ensured the economic and institutional restructuring begun in 1789 actually survived. He prevented a full return to the old regime by providing the stability to lock in the gains that mattered most to the emerging middle classes.
And I would argue that Napoleon proved that power, not principle, ultimately triumphed in the revolution's immediate aftermath. His empire tragically confirmed that a revolution dedicated to liberty can, through instability, pave the way for a more efficient, centralized form of tyranny. The political ideals of 1789 were absolutely betrayed, even if some practical, commercially focused reforms were preserved for the benefit of the French elite.
The path from the Bastille to Waterloo is certainly complex. It demonstrates that the pursuit of fundamental rights, well, it doesn't always result in clear, linear success. It shows that devastating tension between securing stability and preserving the fragile promise of self-governance.
It really forces us to weigh the immediate value of order against the long-term cost of sacrificing popular sovereignty. We're left to decide whether Napoleon was the necessary heir who saved the revolution's body, or the ultimate betrayer who sacrificed its soul.